Welcome back to Student Hub Live. In this session, we are going to focus on research-led teaching in the School of Social Sciences and Global Studies. I'm joined by Derek Matravers, who is Professor of Philosophy and chairs the Philosophy MA and has a full-time Open University staff as part of its teaching. And at the moment, Derek is researching what we should do with cultural heritage. So more on that later. Suzanne Newcombe, I'm also joined by, who is a senior lecturer in religious studies. She researches contemporary religion using a social scientific and social historical methods. And much of Suzanne's research has been on religious beliefs and practices in Indian and Buddhist origin in Britain and also in modern India. So welcome today. We're going to start by thinking about this notion of how we encourage students to think like researchers. So I wonder if we can talk about different sorts of experiences that they may bring and that they're going to focus on as they begin to shift in their development.
Okay. I think it's a characteristic difference really between sort of learning at places prior to university and learning at university. In that when you're at university, there's not really all that much difference between, that's an exaggeration. There's an overlap between teaching and research. So between learning and research. So particularly in the subjects that Suzanne and I come from, if you're learning, then you're thinking through issues, you're trying to come up with your own views of issues, which is pretty much exactly what people like Suzanne and I are paid to do, or at least part of our jobs. So I think that it's characteristic of higher education that there's the distinction between learning and research just kind of starts to break down.
And then, so there are these different skills that people are bringing, but then what does research-led teaching have to do with that notion of students beginning to think differently?
Well, I think there are two things really. I mean, the one is that for people like Suzanne and myself, we're part of what we're supposed to do is to go out into the world, talk to other people, work out the sort of cutting edge answers to things, make sure that we're pushing forward the boundaries of knowledge. People will sometimes say pushing back the boundaries of knowledge, but that sounds to be a retrograde step. So we're pushing forward the boundaries of knowledge, and we can then take those results and actually incorporate them into the courses that we provide for students. So that's one thing, and one very important thing, because that means that students then are getting the most recent, the cutting edge kind of stuff in the topic. But the second thing is that if you're a researcher yourself, then you kind of you know what you're doing because you're doing it all the time, and part of your teaching then sort of becomes part of your research. I think if we weren't, it's a bit like I suppose if you were at a university and you were taught entirely by people who didn't do research, but it would be a bit like being at a cookery school and being taught entirely by people who didn't cook. I mean, that's just it might work for a bit, but it's just not going to work in the long time because you're not going to get the kind of skills at the kind of level that you deserve.
So it's important that when you're learning, people from students have experience from people who are engaged in the real world, doing real things with real projects. Suzanne, I wonder if you can sort of talk about, from a religious studies concept, how those might sort of happen. Can you give us any examples of things that are in your materials?
Well, I really liked that cooking metaphor because I think there's a lot about research that's really, really similar to cooking. Like you have a textbook, like your cookbook, and it kind of says what to do, but the difference between being a good cook and being a researcher, which is what we're trying to teach you at university level, is knowing that, like, if you add a bit more of this spice, it might actually make everything much more delicious. Or you can substitute yogurt and milk for buttermilk if you don't have buttermilk in your fridge. And so this is something that really came concretely into my research on longevity recipes and practices in modern India and how those relate to yoga. So one of the things I was doing with my colleagues who study Sanskrit texts is we're looking at how these ancient recipes are recreated. And we went to try to recreate some of these Sanskrit recipes and the people who do them. And so like from that project, I have this little mortar and a pestle, and I've got a string of pearls here. And so one of the kind of rejuvenative recipes is you grind up the pearls with a bit of rose water And the whole process takes hours, and it's very meditative. And there's a whole kind of really felt sense as to you're transforming your own mind, and that's going into the medicine. So it's about a lot more than just like the list of ingredients that you might get on the bottle of your pill. And the people who are interested in this system are also experiencing a lot more and buying into a lot more than what's on the tin, or what the ingredients are on the cookbook list.
So I guess what you're saying is that, in terms of religious studies, it's not really that, is God really there question that you're concerned about. It's what is the meaning of this behavior that people are doing, these practices, and how do those practices then become embedded within the culture?
Absolutely. We're really interested in religion as lived and non-religion as lived. And for this, you need to really interrogate your own self as a researcher. What are your reactions to this material? And also, what's the empirical evidence? What can you find when you talk to people, when you see people? What are they interacting with? How are they affected by the real world? And how do they affect the real world?
So things aren't always as they seem. Now, we asked people at home, what are some of the stereotypes of religious studies or philosophy academics? You two are probably not who we expected to meet at all, but let's see what they had to say. So they say that the people who ask questions, which is the key thing there, but also it's about provoking thought. Philosophers and pipes. Derek, I don't think you have your pipe today. In fact, Derek's been involved in a philosophy boxing match more like with us at Student Hub Live in the past. Old men, very interesting. Waste of money, over opinionated. So some key stereotypes here, which I suspect you're not too amazed with. So Suzanne has said, Derek, that religious studies is not about just asking whether God is there. I mean, philosophy always just spins my mind with some of the questions that you guys are interested in. But what might you add to that in terms of some of your key concerns then?
I mean, one stereotype of philosophy, one stereotype that people have of philosophy is that we're the world could do without us. We're a kind of fifth wheel. And I mean, it's true that philosophers, there's plenty of work within philosophy that we can get done. But actually, philosophy's central, I think, one of the key concerns in philosophy is what ought people to do. I mean, not so much about what they do, but what they should do. And the question of what people should do is pretty much all over the world. And so a lot of philosophical research that we do, that it goes out and just looks at various bits of life and bits of the world and says, well, what should be done here? So for any, you can just think about anything: sport, science, art. There's a philosophy of sport, there's a philosophy of science, philosophy of art. And one of my colleagues, John Pike, who works in the philosophy of sport, in his research is mainly trying to work out how to balance fairness, safety, all the various different values that might enter into sport, how to balance them all against each other, while at the same time resulting in exciting games of sport. So I think philosophy, there's kind of endless amounts of philosophy research that you can do.
And what's interesting is that you've both coming at this from very different perspectives. And one thing that we've learned today is that, while some of our discipline areas are quite distinct, they also feed into each other. I mean, one of the things that I know, Derek, you're very concerned with is about, thinking critically, logically and carefully in line with, the philosophical traditions. Whereas Suzanne, for you, it's very much about this lived experience. And so, you might meet Derek's research by saying, well, actually, there are other areas that are important aspects of consideration. And this community of researchers, I think, makes the OU such a thriving place in terms of being located within a school where we can share information and support for each other.
Absolutely. And I think philosophy and religious studies are almost like two sides of the same coin sometimes, because we do need the critical analytical thinking skills that philosophy is really good at teaching. But as a social science, more sociology-based religious studies department, we're looking not at so much as what people should do, but what they actually do once they say they should do this and why. So we're kind of looking at the messiness of people, and we also need the clarity that philosophy provides.
And one of the things that many of our students who are at level 1 today here may meet is the sort of merging of things together. In A111, religious studies and philosophy sort of dealt with together as a partnership. Derek, I think, was one of your colleagues, Carolyn Price, who did some interesting work around that. Can you fill us in?
Well, Carolyn wrote about compassion, and there's I mean, she was an expert on the emotions, or she is an expert on the emotions, wrote about various emotions, guilt, compassion, and the like. But there's no, I mean, it would just be daft to sit in your room and say, okay, I'm going to start from scratch and, think about these emotions from the ground up. So there's a very, very long tradition of thinking of these things in Buddhist thought. So it makes complete sense or made complete sense for Carolyn to go and read what had been done in the Buddhist tradition of thought, just in order to learn learn a load of sensible things about the emotions that she studied. So I think, philosophy, you're going to make life extraordinarily hard for yourself if you try and start everything from scratch. So you have to learn from what other people have said, and that means researching what they have said. And it's also the case that you'll make life hard for yourself if you try and tackle the subjects by yourself. And most topics that we deal with now are so complicated and so vast that you really are going to need help from people who are experts in other branches of the area that you're studying, as well as yourself. And I just coming off a big project researching, which was at least in part and main part actually on the philosophy of war, which was not a topic I knew much about, but fortunately I could find people who were, had spent their life studying the philosophy of war. So then you look at my research, you look at their research, you could put them together, and you hope to come up with something that neither of us could do on our own.
Mm-hmm. Now, you've both made the point that being active researchers really benefits students, and I wonder if we could sort of develop that in terms of thinking about how that sort of translates in terms of the tuition that our students receive as well. Suzanne, I wonder if you could sort of talk about some of the module materials and the work that some of you and your colleagues have done in terms of bringing your research to life and being able to add new insights that people may not have been able to get from other sources.
Well, part of being an active researcher is joining in the academic discussion, which, like Derek was saying, is you don't want to start from scratch. You want to start from building on the shoulders of everyone who's gone before you. And a really interesting thing about religious studies is how what religion is changes in different contexts. So one of my colleagues, Graham Harvey, has done decades of research amongst Indigenous peoples, and how the categories they think with, how their way of being in the world really challenges our ideas about what religion is and how we divide up these categories of this is religion, this is superstition, this is something not worth considering, or this is philosophy. And in fact, the work on Buddhism and compassion also kind of brings up questions of where do you draw the line between philosophy and religion. And that's one of the things that's really part of being a researcher in the social sciences, is what are the concepts we're working with and why.
Derek, what about philosophy? You sort of made this point that we want people to be able to experience things. It's not just about following like the instructions of a recipe, etc. So can you talk a little bit through about how some of you and your colleagues have used your own insights to again provide something unique?
Yeah, my favorite example of this is a block on the philosophy MA, which was done by my colleague Sophie Grace Chappell. And Sophie Grace, unlike me, is fluent in ancient Greek, and she was writing about the Platonic text, the Meno. And the first thing she did, and apparently this is not unusual amongst people who study ancient philosophy, was she did her own translation of the Meno. So that meant she had gone through every single word of the Greek text and thought about what the English equivalent would be, thought about how the ideas came, blah, 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 blah. So when she came to write the module material, she had actually thought through every single thing in the Meno from syllables up. And so that and then she was able to bring in the work that other people had done on the Meno. So you obviously look at the secondary literature, talk to other experts on the Meno. But having done all this groundwork, she was able to come with her own ideas of what the Meno was about. Very, very aware of how it fitted together, where the tensions were, And that just made the module material an awful lot more exciting and an awful lot more insightful than it would have been had, for example, I done it, as I just don't have the skills to pull together a translation of the Mino out of my back pocket.
And what's so wonderful about the experience for OU students is that they get to meet through lectures and forums the people who are involved with many of these things. So, you know, even coming and meeting you here today at Student Hub Live, students can begin to experience an interaction with the team, which is really, really fantastic. We're nearly out of time, and so I just wondered if we could look at the areas in which these go into employment and other sort of, I guess, out of school context. So how does research-led teaching then help students then with things like employment or their roles outside of their study? I wonder if both of you could give a quick point on that. Suzanne, I wonder if you might want to go first.
I really liked the big asking questions in that word cloud you gave to begin with, because I think a lot of what you learn as an OU student and as a researcher is how to ask the right questions and how to look for evidence that might be supportive of your answer. So one of the brilliant things about teaching mature students is they have so much life experience that they can draw on, and part of what we're trying to teach you is how to use your own experience as a researcher. And that's exactly what you need to do in any employment context, particularly anything to do with people, is how to look at what's in front of you, what is the evidence, what are the questions asking, what are the concepts you're using, are these the right questions, are these the right concepts, and how does that relate between the personal and the kind of more evidence-based collective evidence you can find.
Yeah. And Derek, what about philosophy then? How might that sort of help with some of these big challenges like identity roles outside of studying and employment?
Well, philosophy. Well, actually, two things. Can I just start? Just quick preface by saying that although it might you say, and I'm sure you're right, that it's exciting for the students to meet us academics. I mean, since the decline of summer school, we've had to kind of wait for the advent of technology in order for people like Suzanne and myself and my colleagues to meet the students, which is we're doing increasingly more of, and that's, as Suzanne was just saying, is extremely good for us, very challenging, and so on and so forth. I think that one of the great things about philosophy, and indeed about pretty much all the academic subjects that you meet in the school, is that research in it means working stuff through yourself, having to clarify your ideas, having to sort them out in a kind of defensible way, and then having to be able to put forward a case in which you'll be able to state your views. And those are just really the key transferable skills, not only for employment, but also for just having a good quality of life. Make you more articulate, more clear in your thinking, more able to spot, to use a philosophical term, bullshit, and just generally sort of hone in on the things that you need to hone in on.
No, absolutely. Well, we asked people at home what they thought people who were working in an academic context spent their days doing. They said things like thinking and writing, but other things like research, teaching, asking questions, and a word I particularly like here, pontificating, which I think, Derek, you might want to take claim for. Damon, quick trip to you. How's everyone at home?
Yeah, this really interesting session. So yeah, I mean, Peter's highlighted that philosophy is useful for studying all subjects, and religious studies stretches imagination across some very different cultures. So yeah, that understanding that the two subjects are more than what they seem to be, I think is something that everyone's really taken hold of here. So yeah, really interesting session, really good.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Derek and Suzanne. That's been absolutely fantastic. We're out of time, I'm afraid. We're going to have a quick video break where we're going to look at what are the alternatives to prison and the cost of youth violence, because our last session today is going to focus on careers in criminology. So stay tuned and we'll see you in just a few minutes after these ads.